I was invited to spend the year in Stanford, California, at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. During that year, I was given all the support, encouragement, and freedom to do whatever I wanted, and I was assured that I was not responsible to anyone for anything. There, on a beautiful hill, roughly 30 miles from San Francisco, with a whole year in which to do anything my heart desired, I chose to write this book, surrounded as I was by the beauty of the countryside, and close as I was to the excitement of San Francisco. Why did I lock myself in a cubicle and write a book? It's not that I'm crazy, and it's not that I needed the money. If there's a single reason why I wrote this book, it's that I once heard myself tell a large class of sophomores that social psychology is a young science, and it made me feel like a coward. Let me explain. We social psychologists are fond of saying that social psychology is a young science, and it is a young science. Of course, astute observers have been making interesting pronouncements and proposing exciting hypotheses about social phenomena at least since the time of Aristotle, but these pronouncements and hypotheses were not seriously tested until well into the 20th century. The first systematic social psychological experiment was conducted by Triplett in 1898, but it was not until the late 1930s that experimental social psychology really took off, primarily under the inspiration of Kurt Lewin and his talented students. By the same token, it is interesting to note that, although Aristotle first asserted some of the basic principles of social influence and persuasion around 350 BC, it was not until the middle of the 20th century that those principles were put to the experimental test by Karl Hovland and his associates. In another sense, however, to claim that social psychology is a young science is to be guilty of a gigantic cop-out. It's a way of pleading with people not to expect too much from us. Specifically, it can be our way of dodging the responsibility for, and avoiding the risks inherent in, applying our findings to the problems of the world we live in. In this sense, protesting that social psychology is a young science is akin to claiming that we are not yet ready to say anything important, useful, or relevant. The purpose of this volume is unashamedly to spell out the relevance that socio-psychological research might have for some of the problems besetting contemporary society. Most of the data discussed in this volume are based on experiments. Most of the illustrations and examples, however, are derived from current social problems, including prejudice, propaganda, war, alienation, aggression, unrest, and political upheaval. This duality reflects two of my own biases that I cherish. The first is that the experimental method is the best way to understand a complex phenomenon. It is a truism of science that the only way to really know the world is to reconstruct it. That is, in order to truly understand what causes what, we must do more than simply observe. Rather, we must be responsible for producing the first what so that we can be sure that it really caused the second what. My second bias is that the only way to be certain that the causal relations uncovered in experiments are valid is to bring them out of the laboratory and into the real world. Thus, as a scientist, I like to work in a laboratory. As a citizen, however, I like to have windows through which I can look out upon the world. Windows, of course, work in both directions. We often derive hypotheses from everyday life. We can best test these hypotheses under the sterile conditions of the laboratory, and in order to try to keep our ideas from becoming sterile, we attempt to take our laboratory findings back out through the window to see if they hold up in the real world. Implicit in all this is my belief that social psychology is extremely important, that social psychologists can play a vital role in making the world a better place. Indeed, in my more grandiose moments, I ate the social animal, nurse the secret belief that social psychologists are in a unique position to have a profound and beneficial impact on our lives by providing an increased understanding of such important phenomena as conformity, persuasion, prejudice, love, and aggression. Now that my secret belief is no longer a secret, I can promise only to try not to force it down the readers' throats on the following pages. Rather, I'll leave it to the readers to decide, after they have finished this volume, whether social psychologists have discovered or can ever discover anything useful, much less anything uniquely important. Compared with other texts in social psychology, this is a slim volume, and purposely so. It is meant to be a brief introduction to the world of social psychology, not an encyclopedic catalog of research and theory. Because I opted to make it brief, I had to be selective. This means both that there are some traditional topics I chose not to cover and that I have not gone into exhaustive detail with those topics I did choose to cover. Because of my desire to keep the book compact and accessible, it was a difficult book to write. I have had to be more a news analyst than a reporter. For example, there are many controversies that I did not fully describe. Rather, I exercised my own judgment, made an educated assessment of what is currently the most accurate description of the field, and stated it as clearly as I could. This decision was made with the student in mind. This book was written for students, not for my colleagues. If I have learned one thing in a half-century of college teaching, it is that, although a detailed presentation of all positions is useful to one's colleagues, it tends to leave students cold. Students, in effect, ask us what time it is, and we, in effect, present them with a chart showing the various time zones around the world, a history of time telling from the sundial to the latest computerized creation, and a detailed description of the anatomy of the grandfather clock. By the time we've finished, they've lost interest in the question. Nothing is safer than to state all sides of all issues, but few things are more boring. Although I have discussed controversial issues, I have not hesitated to draw conclusions. In short, I have attempted to be brief without being unfair, and I have tried to present complex material simply and clearly without oversimplifying. Only the reader can determine how successful I have been in accomplishing either of these goals. When I finished writing the first edition of this book in 1972, I thought I was done with it. How naive. Early in 1975, I decided, with why I wrote this book 9, some reluctance, to revise this book for the first time. A lot had happened in 3 years. Not only had new and exciting things been discovered in the field of social psychology, but, even more important, the world had taken a few major turns since the winter of 1972, when I put the final scrawl on my yellow pad for the first edition. To name just a few of the major events, a brutal, draining, and divisive war came to an end. A vice president and a president of the United States were forced to resign in humiliation, and the women's liberation movement was beginning to have a significant impact on the consciousness of the nation. These were socio-psychological events of the greatest significance. The indolent slob who lives inside me was forced to acknowledge that any book that purports to be about our lives, yours and mine, must strive to stay abreast of the times. Needless to say, it didn't end with one revision. As it turned out, the steady march of events has forced me to revise the book every 3 or 4 years. Again, not only do societal events change rapidly, but social psychology, being a vibrant science, continues to produce interesting new concepts and findings. To fail to keep in touch with this research would be a disservice to the serious student, but here, an author must be careful. In our zeal to be thoroughly modern, there is a tendency for textbook writers to neglect perfectly respectable research just because it happens to be more than 10 years old. Here's how it happens. We writers want to retain the classics and we want to add the research that has come out since the last edition. But we don't want the book to get much fatter. Something has to go, and so, in most textbooks, a lot of good research gets swept into oblivion, not because it has been replaced by something better, only by something newer. This creates the illusion that the field lacks continuity, that is, there's the classic research and the modern research with very little in between. This is terribly misleading. Over the past 4 decades, I have tried to deal with this problem by steadfastly refusing to replace a fine middle-aged study by a newer one unless the newer one added something important to our understanding of the phenomenon being discussed. In the 11th edition, I have discussed several new studies that were performed during the past 5 years, but I hasten to add that, by and large, these studies really are new, not simply recent. My hope is that the revisions of The Social Animal retain the compact grace of the original and remain up to date without eliminating or shortchanging the fine research of the recent past. The Social Animal. Acknowledgements. I am indicated on the title page as the sole author of this book, and it is certainly true that I wrote down all the words and did most of the thinking that produced them. Accordingly, if there are any stupidities in this book, they are mine, and if anything you read on these pages makes you angry, I'm the person you should yell at. At the same time, I want to confess that I never do anything entirely by myself. Many people contributed their knowledge and ideas to my word factory, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their generous help. For the first edition of this book, Vera Aronson and Ellen Burchide were particularly helpful. They painstakingly went over the original manuscript, page by page and line by line, making numerous suggestions and criticisms that had a significant impact on the final form of this book. Moreover, their enthusiasm for the project was infectious and helped me to climb out of frequent bouts of writer's despair. Several other people contributed valuable ideas and suggestions. I cannot possibly cite them all, but the most significant contributors were Nancy Aston, Leonard Berkowitz, David Bradford, John Darley, Richard S. Turlin, Jonathan Friedman, James Friel, Robert Helmreich, Judy Hilton, Michael Kahn, John Kaplan, Judson Mills, and Jeff Sykes. Most of this book was written while I was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, California, and I am deeply grateful to the staff of that fine institution for providing me with the necessary leisure and facilities. Finally, I am pleased to report that my friend and mentor, Leon Festinger, did not have anything to do with this manuscript, directly. He never read it, and, to my knowledge, he was not even aware that I was writing it. He is, however, responsible for its existence. Leon was a wonderful teacher and a demanding role model. I could say that he taught me all I know about social psychology, but that would be a gross understatement. He taught me something much more valuable than that. He taught me how to find out the things that neither I nor anybody else knew. March 1972. This book is now in its 11th edition. One might say that I have grown old revising it. It is a bittersweet feeling to be able to trace the passage of time by watching the face on the back cover of this book become increasingly wrinkled and gray-bearded. When I first wrote the book, I was moved to acknowledge my indebtedness to my friend and mentor, Leon Festinger. It goes without saying that I still feel gratitude and affection for that good and great man. If anything, these feelings intensified over the years. I loved being his student, and I guess I will never stop being his student. In 1989, Leon died, marking the end of an important era in social psychology. He is sorely missed, not only by those of us who knew and loved him, but also by anyone who has been influenced by his research and theories. This would include just about anyone who has ever been a student of social psychology. In addition, as this book and I have grown older, I have become increasingly aware of my indebtedness to my own students. Every 4 years, as I begin revising the book, I am struck by the realization that these are not simply my own ideas, rather, they are ideas I have developed in collaboration with my students. Over the past 5 decades, I have been blessed with a great many outstanding students, from my very first research assistants in 1960 to my most recent students at the University of California, Santa Cruz. They have all taught me a great deal, and it is a pleasure to acknowledge my debt to all of them. I have also enjoyed talking with and stealing ideas from some remarkably gifted colleagues. 2 of them in particular, Anthony Pratkanis and Carol Tavris, have contributed a great deal to the continued improvement and updating of this book. It is a pleasure to acknowledge their generosity. There is a sense in which this book is a family enterprise. This has been especially true during the past 2 decades when I have X12 The Social Animal, experienced the singular gratification of being deeply influenced by my grown children, each in his or her own fashion. First among equals is my youngest son, Joshua Aronson, who takes great delight in trying to keep me on my toes regarding recent methodological and theoretical innovations. More specifically, He has provided me with invaluable insights and suggestions about changes to be made in the 9th, 10th, and the 11th editions of this book and has done much of the writing and integrating of the new material. My eldest son, Hal Aronson, helps to keep my focus broader than the confines of the laboratory, and my middle children, Neil Aronson and Julie Aronson, toil in the trenches of human service on a day-to-day basis, reminding me by their example that, ultimately, social psychology must strive to be useful to people in their daily lives. In addition, Patricia Voda, Joshua's ace research assistant, provided many helpful suggestions and indispensable bibliographic and research assistance. Finally, as you may have noticed, the dedication of this book reads, to Vera, of course. The Vera in question is Vera Aronson, who has been my best friend and favorite consultant for more than 55 years and who also happens to be my wife. To anyone who knows us well, the phrase of course in the dedication is redundant. And, because redundancy is an occupational hazard in the teaching game, I must admit that it is almost certainly not the last redundancy you will need to put up with. Elliot Aronson, December, 2010. Acknowledgements 13. The social animal. Man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally is either beneath our notice or more than human. Society is something in nature that precedes the individual. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is so self-sufficient as not to need to, and therefore does not partake of society, is either a beast or a god. Aristotle, Politics, circa 328 BC. Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, ink on paper, originally published in The New Yorker, November 1, 1958. Copyright the Saul Steinberg Foundation, Artists' Rights Society, New York. 1. What is social psychology? As far as we know, Aristotle was the first serious thinker to formulate some of the basic principles of social influence and persuasion. However, although he did say that man is a social animal, it is unlikely that he was the first person to make that observation. Moreover, chances are he was not the first person to marvel at the truth of that statement while simultaneously puzzling over its triteness and insubstantiality. Although it is certainly true that humans are social animals, so are a host of other creatures, from ants and bees to monkeys and apes. What does it mean to say that humans are social animals? Let's look at some concrete examples. A college student named Sam and 4 of his acquaintances are watching a presidential candidate make a speech on television. Sam is favorably impressed. He likes him better than the opposing candidate because of his sincerity. After the speech, one of the other students asserts that she was turned off by the candidate, that she considered him to be a complete phony, and that she prefers the opposing candidate. All of the others are quick to agree with her. Sam looks puzzled and a trifle distressed. Finally, he mumbles to his acquaintances, "I guess he didn't come across as sincere as I would have hoped." A second-grade teacher stands before her class and asks, "What is the sum of 6, 9, 4, and 11? A girl in the third row puzzles over the question for several seconds, hesitates, raises her hand tentatively, and when called on, haltingly answers, 30? The teacher nods, smiles at her, says, "Nice work, Carol," and pastes a gold star on her forehead. She then asks the class, "What is the sum of 7, 4, 8, 3, and 10? Without wasting a moment, Carol leaps to her feet and shouts, 32. A 4-year-old boy is given a toy drum for his birthday. After pounding on it for a few minutes, he casts it aside and studiously ignores it for the next several weeks. One day a friend comes to visit, picks up the drum, and is about to play with it. Suddenly the young owner tears the drum from his friend's grasp and proceeds to play with it as if it had always been his favorite toy. A 10-year-old girl avidly consumes 2 bowls of Wheaties daily because an Olympic gymnastics champion endorses the product and implies that she owes her athletic prowess, in part, to the consumption of that particular brand of cereal. A shopkeeper who has lived his entire life in a small town in Montana has never had any contact with real, live black people, but he knows they are unintelligent, lazy, and oversexed. Charlie, a high school senior, has recently moved to a new city. He used to be quite popular, but not anymore. Although the kids at school are civil to him, they have not been particularly friendly. He is feeling lonely, insecure, and unattractive. One day, during lunch period, he finds himself at a table with two of his female classmates. One of them is warm, attractive, intelligent, and vivacious. He has been admiring her and daydreaming about her. For several weeks he has been longing for an opportunity to talk to her. The other young woman is not nearly as appealing. Charlie ignores the vivacious woman of his dreams and begins an earnest conversation with her companion, a college student named Debbie, receives a Dear Jane letter from her longtime boyfriend. Although Debbie has always prided herself on keeping fit and eating sensibly, the rejection sets her on an eating binge, during which she consumes several boxes of Oreos, Malamars, and Fig Newtons in the space of to the social animal weekend. Moreover, although a straight-A student near the top of her class in the engineering department, she flunks an exam in calculus that she normally would have aced. During the war in Vietnam, a few hundred Kent State University students were demonstrating against that war, a common occurrence on college campuses during that troubled time in our history. For some unexplained reason, the Ohio National Guard, assigned to keep the peace on that campus, opened fire, killing 4 of the students. Following the tragedy, a local high school teacher asserted that the slain students deserved to die. She made this statement even though she was well aware of the fact that at least 2 of the victims were not participating in the demonstration but were peacefully walking across campus at the time of the shooting. Indeed, she went on to say, anyone who appears on the streets of a city like Kent with long hair, dirty clothes, or barefooted deserves to be shot. When the Reverend Jim Jones sounded the alert, more than 900 members of the People's Temple settlement in Guyana gathered before him. He knew that some of the members of a congressional investigation party had been murdered and that the sanctity and isolation of Jonestown would soon be violated. Jones proclaimed that it was time for them to die. Vats of poison were prepared, and amid only scattered shouts of protest or acts of resistance, mothers and fathers administered the fatal mixture to their infants and children, drank it themselves, and lay down, arm in arm, waiting to die. On April 20, 1999, the corridors and classrooms of Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, reverberated with the sound of gunshots. 2 students, armed with assault weapons and explosives, had gone on a rampage, killing a teacher and several of their fellow students. They then turned their guns on themselves. After the smoke had cleared, 15 people were dead and 23 were hospitalized, many with severe wounds. Mary has just turned 9. For her birthday, she receives a Suzy homemaker baking and cooking set complete with her own little oven. Her parents chose this present because she seems very interested in culinary things and is forever helping mommy set. What is social psychology? 3. The table, prepare the meals, and clean the house. Isn't it wonderful, says Mary's father, how at age 9 she is already interested in being a housewife. Little girls must have housewifery built into their genes. Those feminists don't know what they're talking about. My boyhood friend, George Woods, is African American. When he and I were growing up together in Massachusetts in the 1940s, he thought of himself as a colored boy and felt inferior to his white friends. There were many reasons for this feeling. That George was treated like an inferior by the white community had a direct influence upon him. Of course, a number of other forces influenced him less directly. In those days, George could entertain himself by turning on the radio and listening to Amos and Andy, an enormously popular radio show in which black adults were portrayed as naive children, as stupid, lazy, and illiterate, but rather cute, not unlike friendly, domesticated animals. The black characters were, of course, played by white actors. In films, George could see the stereotyped colored man, usually a chauffeur or some other menial. A standard plot would have the colored man accompany the white hero into a haunted house, where they heard a strange and ominous noise. The camera would pan in on the colored man's face, his eyes growing large with fright. He would scream, "Feets, do your stuff," and dashed through the door. Not taking time to open it first. We can only guess what George experienced while viewing these films in the company of his white friends. Things change. For example, although discrimination and unfairness are still very much a part of our society, George Woods's grandchildren, growing up in the 21st century, do not face exactly the same tribulations as George himself did. The mass media now depict blacks in roles that are not exclusively menial. In the latter part of the 20th century, pride in being black began to emerge, along with an interest in, and enthusiasm about African American history and culture, and in 2008, the progress culminated in the election of Barack Obama, the first African American president. Society is influencing George's grandchildren in a much different way than it influenced George. Although things change, we should not be complacent in the belief that all changes move in a linear, humanistic direction. On. For the Social Animal, August 30, 1936, during the Spanish Civil War, a single plane bombed Madrid. There were several casualties, but no one was killed. The world was profoundly shocked by the idea of a congested city being attacked from the air. Newspaper editorials around the world expressed the general horror and indignation of the citizenry. Only 9 years later, U.S. planes dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. More than 200,000 people were killed and countless thousands suffered severe injuries. Shortly thereafter, a poll indicated that only 4.5% of the U.S. population felt we should not have used those weapons, and an astonishing 22.7% felt we should have used many more of them before Japan had a chance to surrender. Clearly, something had happened during those 9 years to influence opinion. A definition: what is social psychology? Many definitions are possible. Instead of listing some of these definitions, it might be more informative to let the subject matter define the field. The examples presented on the preceding pages are all illustrations of socio-psychological situations. As diverse as these situations may be, they do contain one common factor: social influence. The opinion of Sam's friends on the merits of the presidential candidate influenced Sam's judgment. The rewards emanating from the teacher influenced the speed and vigor of Carol's classroom responses. The 4-year-old seemed to find his toy drum more attractive because of the inadvertent influence of his friend's interest. The Olympic athlete's influence on our Wheaties-eating youngster, on the other hand, was far from inadvertent. Rather, it was intentionally designed to motivate her to convince her parents to buy Wheaties. The Montana shopkeeper was certainly not born with an unflattering stereotype of black people in his head. Somebody somehow put it there. Debbie's eating binge and poor performance had something to do with her having been rejected, but precisely how does that work? That Charlie ignored the woman of his dreams almost certainly has something to do with his fear of rejection, the way he was feeling about himself, and his implicit assumption about the relative likelihood of being rejected by either of the two women. Being rejected can have far-reaching consequences, as Debbie's behavior suggests. It may. What is social psychology? 5. Also be that rejection and humiliation played a role in the rampage killings at Columbine High School. Exactly how the high school teacher in Kent, Ohio, came to believe that innocent people deserved to die is a fascinating and frightening question. For now, let us simply say that this belief was probably influenced by her own indirect complicity in the tragic events on campus. A still more disturbing question arises from the events in Jonestown and Columbine. What forces could induce parents to poison their own children and then take their own lives? What is it that induces teenagers to kill their classmates? Again, these are complex questions to which I hope to provide some insights as this text unfolds. Turning to little Mary and her Susie homemaker set, it is conceivable, as Mary's father says, that housewifery is genetic. It is far more likely that, from infancy on, Mary was rewarded and encouraged every time she expressed an interest in such traditionally feminine things as cooking, sewing, and dolls, to a far greater extent than if she expressed an interest in football, boxing, or chemistry. It is also reasonable to assume that, If Mary's kid brother had shown an interest in housewifery, he would not have received a toy kitchen set for his birthday. Also, as with young George Woods, who felt inferior to his playmates, Mary's self-image could have been shaped by the mass media, which have tended to depict women in traditionally feminine roles: housewife, secretary, nurse, school teacher. If we compare the young George Woods with his grandchildren, we see that the self-images of minority group members can change, and these changes can influence and be influenced by changes in the mass media and changes in the attitudes of the general population. This, of course, is graphically illustrated by the opinions of Americans about the use of nuclear weapons in 1945. The concept in the preceding paragraph is social influence. And this becomes our working definition of social psychology: the influences that people have upon the beliefs, feelings, and behavior of others. Using this as our definition, we will attempt to understand many of the phenomena described in the preceding illustrations. How are people influenced? Why do they accept influence, or, put another way, what's in it for them? What are the variables that increase or decrease the effectiveness of social influence? Does such influence have a permanent effect, or is it merely transitory? What are the vari, 6. The social animal, ables that increase or decrease the permanence of the effects of social influence? Can the same principles be applied equally to the attitudes of the high school teacher in Kent, Ohio? And to the toy preferences of young children? How does one person come to like another person? Is it through these same processes that we come to like our new sports car or a box of Wheaties? How does a person develop prejudices against an ethnic or racial group? Is it akin to liking, but in reverse, or does it involve an entirely different set of psychological processes? Most people are interested in questions of this sort, because we as human beings spend a good deal of our time interacting with other people, being influenced by them, influencing them, being delighted, amused, saddened, and angered by them. It is natural that we develop hypotheses about social behavior. In that sense, we are all amateur social psychologists. Although most amateur social psychologists test these hypotheses to their own satisfaction, these tests lack the rigor and impartiality of careful scientific investigation. Often, the results of scientific research are identical with what most people know to be true. This is not surprising. Conventional wisdom is usually based upon shrewd observations that have stood the test of time. In fact, when you are reading the results of the experiments in this volume, you may occasionally find yourself thinking, "That's obvious, why did they spend time and money to discover that one?" There are several reasons why we do experiments, even though the results often seem unsurprising. For one thing, we are all susceptible to the hindsight bias, which refers to our tendency to overestimate our powers of prediction once we know the outcome of a given event. For example, research has shown that on the day after an election, when people are asked which candidates they would have picked to win, they almost always believe they would have picked the actual winners, even though the day before the election, their predictions wouldn't have been nearly as accurate. Similarly, the outcome of an experiment almost always seems more predictable once we have the results in hand than if we had been asked to predict the results without the benefit of hindsight. In addition, it is important to conduct research, even if the results seem obvious, because many of the things we know to be true turn out to be false when carefully investigated. For example, what is social psychology? 7. Seems reasonable to assume that people who are threatened with severe punishment for engaging in a certain behavior might eventually learn to despise that behavior. But when tested empirically, this assumption turns out to be wrong. People who are threatened with mild punishment develop a dislike for the forbidden behavior. People who are severely threatened show, if anything, a slight increase in liking for the forbidden behavior. Likewise, most of us, from our own experience, would guess that, if we overheard someone saying nice things about us, we would tend to like that person, all other things being equal. This turns out to be true. But what is equally true is that we tend to like that person even more if some of the remarks we overhear are anything but nice. More will be said about these phenomena in the following chapters. In our attempt to understand human social behavior, professional social psychologists have a great advantage over most amateur social psychologists, although, like the amateurs, we professionals usually begin with careful observation. We can go far beyond that. We do not need to wait for things to happen so that we can observe how people respond. We can, in fact, make things happen. That is, social psychologists can conduct an experiment in which scores of people are subjected to particular events. Moreover, we can do this in situations in which everything can be held constant, except the particular events being investigated. Professional social psychologists can, therefore, draw conclusions based on data far more precise and numerous than those available to the amateur social psychologist, who must depend upon observations of events that occur randomly and under complex circumstances where many things are happening at once. Nearly all the data presented in this book are based upon experimental evidence. It is important, for this reason, that the reader understands what constitutes an experiment in social psychology and understands the advantages, disadvantages, ethical problems, excitements, headaches, and heartaches that are associated with this adventure. Although an understanding of the experimental method is important, it is by no means essential to an understanding of the substantive material presented here. Therefore, the chapter Social Psychology as a Science is the final one in this book. As a reader, you can peruse this chapter before reading on, if you prefer to 8 the social animal, understand the technicalities before delving into the substantive material, or you can read it at any point on your journey through the book, whenever your interest is piqued. People who do crazy things are not necessarily crazy. The social psychologist studies social situations that affect people's behavior. Occasionally, these natural situations become focused into pressures so great that they cause people to behave in ways easily classifiable as abnormal. When I say people, I mean very large numbers of people. To my mind, it does not increase our understanding of human behavior to classify these people as psychotic. It is much more useful to try to understand the nature of the situation and the processes that were operating to produce the behavior. This leads us to Aronson's first law. People who do crazy things are not necessarily crazy. Let us take, as an illustration, the Ohio school teacher who asserted that the 4 Kent State students deserved to die. I don't think she was alone in this belief, and although all the people who hold this belief may be insane, I seriously doubt it. Moreover, I doubt that classifying them as psychotic does much to enhance our understanding of the phenomenon. Similarly, in the aftermath of the Kent State slayings, the rumor spread that the slain girls were pregnant anyway, so that it was a blessing they died, and that all 4 of the students were so filthy and so covered with lice that the mortuary attendants became nauseated while examining the bodies. These rumors, of course, were totally false. But, according to James Michener, they spread like wildfire. Were all the people who believed and spread these rumors insane? Later in this book, we will examine the processes that produce this kind of behavior, to which most of us are susceptible, under the right socio-psychological conditions. One of my former students, Ellen Burscheid, has observed that people have a tendency to explain unpleasant behavior by attaching a label to the perpetrator, thereby excluding that person from the rest of us nice people. In that way, we need not worry about the unpleasant behavior because it has nothing. What is social psychology? 9. To do with us nice folks. According to Burscheid, the danger in this kind of thinking is that it tends to make us smug about our own susceptibility to situational pressures that could produce unpleasant behavior, and it leads to a rather simple-minded approach to the solution of social problems. Specifically, such a simple-minded solution might include the development of a set of diagnostic tests to determine who is a liar, who is a sadist, who is corrupt, who is a maniac. Social action might then consist of identifying these people and relegating them to the appropriate institutions. Of course, I am not saying that psychosis does not exist or that psychotics should never be institutionalized, nor am I saying that all people are the same and respond exactly as crazily to the same intense social pressures. To repeat, What I am saying is that some situational variables can move a great proportion of us normal adults to behave in very unappetizing ways. It is of paramount importance that we attempt to understand these variables and the processes that produce unpleasant or destructive behavior. An illustration might be useful. Think of a prison. Consider the guards. What are they like? Chances are that most people would imagine prison guards to be tough, callous, unfeeling people. Some might even consider them to be cruel, tyrannical, and sadistic. People who take this kind of dispositional view of the world might suggest that people become guards to have an opportunity to exercise their cruelty with relative impunity. Now picture the prisoners. What are they like? Rebellious? Docile? No matter what specific pictures exist inside our heads, the point is that there are pictures there, and most of us believe that the prisoners and the guards are quite different from us in character and personality. This may be true, but it may be more complicated. In a dramatic demonstration, Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues created a simulated prison in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University. Into this prison he brought a group of normal, mature, stable, intelligent, young men. By flipping a coin, Zimbardo designated one half of them prisoners and one half of them guards, and they lived as such for several days. What happened? Let's allow Zimbardo to tell us in his own words. At the end of only 6 days we had to close down our mock prison because what we saw was frightening. It was no longer, the social animal, apparent to us or most of the subjects where they ended and their roles began. The majority had indeed become prisoners or guards, no longer able to clearly differentiate between role-playing and self. There were dramatic changes in virtually every aspect of their behavior, thinking, and feeling. In less than a week, the experience of imprisonment undid a lifetime of learning. Human values were suspended, self-concepts were challenged, and the ugliest, most base, pathological side of human nature surfaced. We were horrified because we saw some boys treat other boys as if they were despicable animals, taking pleasure in cruelty, while other boys became servile, dehumanized robots who thought only of escape, of their own individual survival, and of their mounting hatred of the guards. What is social psychology? 11. Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, Ink on Paper. Originally published in The New Yorker, April 24, 1965. Copyright the Saul Steinberg Foundation, Artists' Rights Society, New York. 2. Conformity. One consequence of the fact that we are social animals is that we live in a state of tension between values associated with individuality and values associated with conformity. James Thurber has captured the flavor of conformity in the following description. Suddenly somebody began to run. It may be that he had simply remembered, all of a moment, an engagement to meet his wife, for which he was now frightfully late. Whatever it was, he ran east on Broad Street. Somebody else began to run, perhaps a newsboy in high spirits. Another man, a portly gentleman of affairs, broke into a trot. Inside of 10 minutes, everybody on High Street, from the Union Depot to the courthouse, was running. A loud mumble gradually crystallized into the dread word damn. The dam has broke. The fear was put into words by a little old lady in an electric car, or by a traffic cop, or by a small boy, nobody knows who, nor does it now really matter. 2,000 people were abruptly in full flight. Go east, was the cry that arose east away from the river, east to safety. Go east. Go east. A tall spare woman with grim eyes and a determined chin ran past me down the middle of the street. I was still uncertain as to what was the matter, in spite of all the shouting. I drew up alongside the woman with some effort, for although she was in her late 50s, she had a beautiful easy running form and seemed to be in excellent condition. What is it? I puffed. She gave a quick glance and then looked ahead again, stepping up her pace a trifle. Don't ask me, ask God, she said. This passage from Thurber, although comical, is an apt illustration of people conforming. 1 or 2 individuals began running for their own reasons. Before long, everyone was running. Why? Because others were running. According to Thurber's story, When the running people realized that the dam hadn't given way after all, they felt pretty foolish, and yet, how much more foolish would they have felt if they hadn't conformed and the dam had, in fact, burst? Is conformity good or bad? In its simplest sense, this is an absurd question. But words do carry evaluative meaning, thus, to be called an individualist or a nonconformist is to be designated, by connotation, as a good person. The label evokes an image of Daniel Boone standing on a mountaintop with a rifle slung over his shoulder, the breeze blowing through his hair, as the sun sets in the background. To be called a conformist, in our culture, is somehow to be designated as an inadequate person. It evokes an image of a row of bureaucratic men dressed in gray flannel suits, carrying identical briefcases, looking as though they had been created by a cookie cutter, but we can use synonymous words that convey very different images. For individualist or nonconformist we can substitute deviate, for conformist we can substitute team player. Somehow, deviate does not evoke Daniel Boone on the mountaintop, and team player does not evoke the cookie cutter, produced bureaucrat. When we look a little closer, we see an inconsistency in the way our society seems to feel about conformity and nonconformity. For example, one of the bestsellers of the 1950s was a book by John F. Kennedy called Profiles in Courage, wherein the author praised several politicians for their courage in resisting great pressure and refusing to conform. To put it another way, Kennedy was praising people who refused to be good team players, who refused to vote or act as their parties or constituents expected them to. Although their actions earned Kennedy's praise long after the deeds were done, the immediate reactions of their colleagues were generally far from positive. Nonconformists may be praised by historians or idolized in films or literature long after the fact of their nonconformity, but they are usually not held in high esteem at the time by those people to whose demands they refuse to conform. This observation receives strong support from a number of experiments in social psychology. For example, in a classic experiment by Stanley Schachter, several groups of students met for a discussion of the case history of a juvenile Dylan, 14, the social animal, Quint named Johnny Rocco. After reading the case, each group was asked to discuss it and to suggest a treatment for Johnny on a scale that ranged from very lenient treatment on one end to very hard treatment on the other. A typical group consisted of approximately 9 participants, 6 of whom were real participants and 3 of whom were paid confederates of the experimenter. The confederates took turns playing one of 3 roles that they had carefully rehearsed in advance: the modal person, who took a position that conformed to the average position of the real participants; the deviate, who took a position diametrically opposed to the general orientation of the group; and the slider, whose initial position was similar to the deviate's but who, in the course of the discussion, gradually slid into a modal, conforming position. The results clearly showed that the person who was liked most was the modal person who conformed to the group norm. The deviate was liked least. In a more recent experiment, Eric Kruglansky and Donna Webster found that when nonconformists voiced a dissenting opinion close to the deadline, they were rejected even more than when they voiced their dissenting opinion earlier in the discussion. Thus, the data indicate that the establishment or modal group tends to like conformists better than nonconformists. Clearly, there are situations in which conformity is highly desirable and nonconformity constitutes an unmitigated disaster. Suppose, for example, that I suddenly decide that I am fed up with being a conformist, so I hop into my car and start driving down the left-hand side of the road. Not a very adaptive way of displaying my rugged individualism, and not very fair to you if you happen to be driving toward me, on the same street. Similarly, consider the rebellious teenager who smokes cigarettes, stays out late, gets tattooed, or dates a certain boy just because she knows her parents disapprove. She is not manifesting independence so much as she is displaying anti-conformity, not thinking for herself but automatically acting contrary to the desires or expectations of others. On the other hand, I do not intend to suggest that conformity is always adaptive and nonconformity is always maladaptive. There are compelling situations in which conformity can be disastrous and tragic. Moreover, Even knowledgeable and sophisticated decision-makers can fall prey to special kinds of conformity pressures inherent. Conformity 15, in making group decisions. Consider the following examples. In his memoirs, Albert Speer, one of Adolf Hitler's top advisors, describes the circle around Hitler as one of total conformity. Deviation was not permitted. In such an atmosphere, even the most barbarous activities seemed reasonable because the absence of dissent, which conveyed the illusion of unanimity, prevented any individual from entertaining the possibility that other options might exist. In normal circumstances, people who turn their backs on reality are soon set straight by the mockery and criticism of those around them. In the Third Reich there were not such correctives. On the contrary, every self-deception was multiplied as in a hall of distorting mirrors, becoming a repeatedly confirmed picture of a fantastical dream world which no longer bore any relationship to the grim outside world. In those mirrors I could see nothing but my own face reproduced many times over. A more familiar but perhaps less dramatic example concerns some of the men involved with former President Richard Nixon and his palace guard in the Watergate cover-up. Here, men in high government office, many of whom were attorneys, perjured themselves, destroyed evidence, and offered bribes without an apparent second thought. This was due, at least in part, to the closed circle of single-mindedness that surrounded the president in the early 1970s. This single-mindedness made deviation virtually unthinkable until after the circle had been broken. Once the circle was broken, several people seemed to view their illegal behavior with astonishment, as if it were performed during some sort of bad dream. John Dean put it this way. Anyway, when you picked up the newspaper in the morning and read the new cover story that had replaced yesterday's cover story, you began to believe that today's news was the truth. This process created an atmosphere of unreality in the White House that prevailed to the very end. If you said it often enough, it would become true. When the press learned of the wiretaps on newsmen and White House staffers, for example, and flat denials failed, it was claimed that this was a national security matter. I'm sure many people believed that the taps were for national security. They weren't. That was concocted as a justify. 16 The social animal, cation after the fact. But when they said it, you understand, they really believed it. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded seconds after launching. 7 astronauts, including a civilian school teacher, perished in a fireball of smoke and flames. The decision had been made to go ahead with the launch despite a near disaster on an earlier Challenger flight and despite strenuous objections and warnings from knowledgeable engineers about the defective O-rings at the joints of the booster rockets. Were key National Aeronautics and Space Administration administrators ignorant of the danger or cavalier about the lives of the astronauts? I doubt it. A more likely explanation involves a number of factors that contributed to flaws in NASA's decision-making process. First, NASA had already conducted 24 successful launches with essentially the same equipment. With their confidence boosted by previous successes, NASA administrators were oriented toward a go decision. Second, NASA officials, like the general public, were caught up in the enthusiasm surrounding the launching of the first civilian into space. Further, according to a penetrating analysis by Yuri Kruglansky, there were additional, practical reasons for NASA administrators to be victimized by their own wishful thinking, given NASA's need to secure congressional funding by displaying its efficiency and productivity. Given the intense public interest in the Teacher in Space program, and given NASA's wish to demonstrate its technological capabilities, liftoff was clearly a more desirable decision than delay. Any mention of possible system failure would have suggested a need to spend more money, a conclusion NASA found distasteful in light of its commitment to cost-effectiveness and economy. Finally, in this atmosphere of enthusiasm and external pressures, no one at NASA wanted to be reminded that any kind of accident was possible, and they weren't. Unlike NASA administrators, engineers at Morton Thiokol were not concerned about the political, economic, and public relations implications of a decision on whether to launch. All they cared about was whether the damn thing would work, and given the sub-freezing temperatures at the launch site, they objected strenuously to the launch. Conformity 17, but the top executives at Morton Thiokol were not so fortunate. For them, more was at stake than a successful launch. They were in great conflict. On the one hand, as engineers, they were sensitive to the opinions of their fellow engineers. On the other hand, as executives, they were dependent on NASA for a contract worth approximately $400 million per year. Thus, in part, they tended to identify with the same concerns that NASA administrators did. According to his testimony before a presidential investigative commission, Robert Lund, Thiokol's vice president of engineering, at first opposed the launch but changed his position after he was advised to take off his engineering hat and put on one representing management. How did the Morton Thiokol executives such as Lund deal with this conflict? Before their last conference with NASA administrators, they polled Thiokol employees, but not the engineers, only other management personnel, who voted to go with the launch. Thus, in a conference between NASA officials and Thiokol executives the night before the fateful launch, participants reinforced one another's commitment to proceed. Let's take stock. What do Hitler's inner circle, Nixon's palace guard, and NASA administrators have in common, aside from the fact that they made tragic decisions? They were relatively cohesive groups isolated from dissenting points of view. When such groups are called upon to make decisions, they often fall prey to what social psychologist Irving Janis calls groupthink. According to Janis, groupthink is the mode of thinking that persons engage in when concurrence-seeking becomes so dominant in a cohesive in-group that it tends to override realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action. Groups engaging in this maladaptive decision-making strategy typically perceive themselves as invulnerable. They're blinded by optimism. And this optimism is perpetuated when dissent is discouraged. In the face of conformity pressures, individual group members come to doubt their own reservations and refrain from voicing dissenting opinions. Consensus seeking is so important that certain members of the group sometimes become mind guards, people who censor troublesome incoming information, as did the executives at Morton Thiokol. By citing these examples, I do not mean to suggest that individuals who make foolish, disastrous decisions should not be held accountable. What I do intend to suggest is that it is a lot easier to 18 the social animal, conduct an inquiry and assign blame than it is to understand the psychological processes underlying faulty decision-making. But it is only through digging deeper and trying to understand these processes that we can have any hope of improving the way people make decisions and thus of reducing the frequency of disastrous decisions in the future. What is conformity? Conformity can be defined as a change in a person's behavior or opinions as a result of real or imagined pressure from a person or a group of people. Most situations are not as extreme as the examples cited above. We will attempt to zero in on the phenomenon of conformity by beginning with a less extreme illustration. Let's return to our friend Sam, the hypothetical college student we first encountered in Chapter 1. Recall that Sam watched a presidential candidate on television and was favorably impressed with his sincerity. However, in the face of the unanimous opinion of his friends that the candidate was insincere, Sam acceded, verbally, at least, to their opinion. Several questions can be asked about this kind of situation. What causes people to conform to group pressure? Specifically, what was in it for Sam? What was the nature of the group pressure? Specifically, what were Sam's acquaintances doing to induce conformity? Did Sam revise his opinion of the candidate during that brief but horrifying period when he learned that all his fellow students disagreed with him? Or was it the case that Sam maintained his original opinion but only modified what he said about the candidate? If there was a change in opinion, was it permanent or merely transient? Unfortunately, we cannot say precisely and definitely what was going on in Sam's mind at the time because there are many factors in the situation that we don't know about. For example, we don't know how confident Sam was in his initial opinion. We don't know how much he liked the people with whom he watched the candidate's speech. We don't know whether Sam considered himself to be a good judge of sincerity or whether he considered the others to be good judges of sincerity. We don't know whether Sam is generally a strong person or a wishy-washy person, and so on. What we can do, Conformity 19, is construct an experimental situation that is somewhat like the one in which Sam found himself, and we can control and vary the factors we think might be important. Such a basic situation was devised by Solomon Asch in a classic set of experiments. Put yourself in the following situation: you have volunteered to participate in an experiment on perceptual judgment. You enter a room with 4 other participants. The experimenter shows all of you a straight line. Simultaneously, he shows you 3 other lines for comparison. Your job is to judge which of the 3 lines is closest in length to line X. The judgment strikes you as being a very easy one. It is perfectly clear to you that line B is the correct answer, and when your turn comes, you will clearly say that B is the one. But it's not your turn to respond. The young man whose turn it is looks carefully at the lines and says, "Line A." Your mouth drops open and you look at him quizzically. How can he believe it's A when any fool can see that it's B? You ask yourself. He must be either blind or crazy. Now it's the second person's turn to respond. He also chooses line A. You begin to feel like Alice in Wonderland. How can it be? You ask yourself, are both of these people blind or crazy? But then the next person responds, and he also says, line A. You take another look at those lines. Maybe I'm the only one who's crazy, you mutter inaudibly. Now it's the fourth person's turn, and he also judges the correct line to be A. Finally, it's your turn. Why, it's line A, of course, you declare. I knew it all the time. This is the kind of conflict that the college students in Asch's experiment went through. As you might imagine, the individuals who answered first were in the employ of the experimenter and were instructed to agree on an incorrect answer. The perceptual judgment at 20. The social animal, self was an incredibly easy one. It was so easy that, when individuals were not subjected to group pressure but were allowed to make a series of judgments of various sizes of lines while alone, there was almost a complete absence of errors. Indeed, the task was so easy, and physical reality was so clear-cut, that Asch himself firmly believed that there would be little, if any, yielding to group pressure. But his prediction was wrong. When faced with a majority of their fellow students agreeing on the same incorrect responses in a series of 12 judgments, approximately 3/4 of the participants conformed at least once by responding incorrectly. When we look at the entire spectrum of judgments, we find that an average of 35% of the overall responses conform to the incorrect judgments rendered by Asch's accomplices. Solomon Asch performed his classic experiment about 60 years ago. Although the results were powerful, it is tempting to dismiss his findings on the grounds that American college students are quite different now. Specifically, with the advent of computers and the internet, you might think we have grown more sophisticated and, therefore, much less susceptible to this kind of group pressure. Not so. Over the years, the Asch experiment has been successfully replicated a great many times. Just a few years ago, in a particularly striking demonstration on national television, Anthony Pratkanis repeated the Asch experiment precisely as Asch did it 50 years earlier. The participants in Pratkanis's experiment were particularly sophisticated college students, most of whom considered themselves nonconformists. The striking results were almost identical to Asch's. Resisting group pressures is very difficult, and this shows up not only on the faces of the participants, but also in their neurological activity. In a recent experiment, Gregory Burns and his associates replicated Asch's procedures while monitoring participants' neural activity with functional magnetic resonance imaging. These scans indicated a major difference between participants who yielded to and those who resisted group pressure. Those who resisted showed a great deal of activity in the amygdala, a region of the brain associated with pain and emotional discomfort. Going against the group is painful. The situation created by these experiments is especially intriguing because, unlike many situations in which we may tend to, Conformity 21, Conform, there were no explicit constraints against individuality. In many situations, the sanctions against nonconformity are clear and unequivocal. For example, I hate to wear a tie, and under most circumstances I can get away with this minor idiosyncrasy. On occasion, however, I can't. I often find myself stopped at the entrance to a restaurant and politely informed that if I refuse to don the tie offered me by the maitre d', I cannot dine in the restaurant. I can either put on the tie and eat in the restaurant or leave, open-necked and comfortable but hungry. The negative consequences of nonconformity are made very explicit, but in Nash's experiment, the situations were much more subtle. In these situations, there were no explicit rewards for conformity and no explicit punishments for deviance. Why, then, did Nash's participants and Sam conform? There are two major possibilities. Either they became convinced, in the face of the judgment of the unanimous majority, that their own opinions were wrong. Or they went along with the crowd in order to be accepted by the majority or to avoid being disliked by them for disagreeing. In short, what I am suggesting is that these individuals had two important goals, the goal of being correct and the goal of staying in the good graces of other people by living up to their expectations. In many circumstances, both of these goals can be satisfied by a simple action. Driving on the right-hand side of the road is the correct thing to do, and it satisfies other people's expectations. So, too, are telephoning your mother on Mother's Day, giving proper directions to a visitor in town, and studying hard to perform well on an exam. Similarly, if others agreed with your judgment of the lengths of the lines, you could satisfy both goals by being true to your own estimate. But, in Nash's experiment, these two goals were placed in conflict. If you were a participant in that experiment and you initially believed that the correct answer was line B, then saying so might satisfy your desire to be correct, but it might also violate the expectations of your peers, and they might think you a bit odd. On the other hand, choosing line A might win you the acceptance of the others, but unless you became convinced that they were correct, it would violate your desire to be right. Most people believe that they are motivated primarily by a desire to be correct but that others are motivated primarily by a desire to stay, 22 the social animal, in the good graces of other people. For example, when people unobtrusively observe a Nash-like conformity experiment, they typically predict that the experimental participants will conform more than they actually do. 11 Interestingly enough, these same surreptitious observers predict that they will conform less than people like themselves actually do. That is, we know other people conform, but we underestimate the extent to which we can be induced to follow the group. Were the yielders in Nash's experiment convinced that their initial judgment was incorrect and the unanimous judgment of the others was right? Probably not, because the judgment of line length was objective and clear. Nash's interviews with his participants strongly suggest that their conformity was merely for public consumption. They were going along to get along. But what about Sam? Was Sam convinced by his fellow college students that his preferred presidential candidate was a phony, or did he simply go along with their judgment in order to be accepted while continuing to believe in the sincerity of the candidate? To answer such a question, we must first consider some of the factors that influence conformity. Factors that increase or decrease conformity, unanimity in situations like the one investigated by Ash. One of the crucial factors that determines the likelihood that the participant's opinion will conform to that of the majority is whether the majority opinion is unanimous. If a participant is joined by even one ally who gives the correct response, his or her conformity to the erroneous judgment of the majority drops sharply. 12 In fact, even if unanimity is broken by a non-ally, the power of the group is seriously diminished. 13 That is, if one of the other group members gives an incorrect response that is different from the error of the majority, the presence of this fellow dissenter dramatically reduces the pressure to conform. And the participant is likely to give the correct response, line B. A fellow dissenter exerts a powerful freeing effect from the influence of the majority. If there is unanimity, however, the actual size of the majority need not be very great for it to elicit maximum conformity from a person. In fact, the tendency for someone, Conformity 23. To conform to group pressure is about as great when the unanimous majority consists of only 3 other people as it is when the unanimous majority is 16. Commitment. One way conformity to group pressure can be decreased is by inducing the individual to make some sort of commitment to his or her initial judgment. Picture yourself as an umpire at a Major League Baseball game. There is a close play at first base and you call the runner out, in the presence of 50,000 fans. After the game, the 3 other umpires approach you and each says that he thought the runner was safe. How likely are you to alter your judgment? Compare this with a situation in which each of the 3 umpires calls the runner safe and then it is your turn to make a judgment. Such a comparison was made in an experiment by Morton Deutsch and Harold Gerard, 14, who used the Ash paradigm and found that where there was no prior commitment, some 25% of the responses conformed to the erroneous judgment of the majority, but, when the individuals had publicly committed themselves before hearing the judgment of the other umpires, only less than 6% of their new responses were conformist. Accountability. Suppose you found yourself being subjected to group pressure while trying to make a decision. In addition, suppose that you knew that, at the end of the session, you would need to justify your decision to the other members of the group. What effect do you think that might have on your decision-making? Research has shown that under most conditions, this kind of accountability to the group tends to increase conformity. 15. But what happens if you were also given instructions indicating that it is important for you to be as accurate as possible? To answer that question, Andrew Quinn and Barry Schlenker 16 put people through a procedure aimed at producing conformity to a poor decision. Before the conformity aspect of the experiment began, the experimenters did 2 things. They got half their participants thinking about the importance of being as accurate as possible while getting the other half thinking about the importance of cooperation. And they made it clear to half the participants in each of those 2 conditions that, after they made a decision, they would need to talk to their partners about their decision. 24. The social animal, and justify having made it. The results were clear. The people who showed the most independence and made the best decisions were those who were oriented toward being accurate and had to explain their nonconformity to the very people whose influence they resisted. It is interesting to note that the people in this condition behaved with greater independence than those people who were oriented toward being accurate but were not held accountable. What this suggests is that most people will go along to get along unless they know that they will be held accountable for a dumb, compliant decision. The person and the culture. Another important factor affecting conformity involves some of the characteristics of the target person. Specifically, individuals who have generally low self-esteem are far more likely to yield to group pressure than those with high self-esteem. Furthermore, task-specific self-esteem plays an important part in the process. If individuals are led to believe that they have little or no aptitude for the task at hand, their tendency to conform increases. Similarly, individuals who are given the opportunity to have prior success with a task like judging the lengths of lines are far less likely to conform than those who walk into the situation cold. 17. Another important factor is how secure the individual feels in a particular group. For example, to return to our previous illustration, if Sam had felt sure that he was liked and accepted by his acquaintances, he would have been more likely to voice disagreement than if he felt insecure in his relationship with them. This assertion receives strong support from an experiment by James Ditz and Harold Kelly 18, in which college men were invited to join an attractive, prestigious group and subsequently were given information about how secure their position was in that group. Specifically, all members of the group were informed that, at any point during the lifetime of the group, the members could remove any member in the interest of efficiency. The group then engaged in a discussion of juvenile delinquency. Periodically, the discussion was interrupted and each member was asked to rate every other member's value to the group. After the discussion, each member was shown how the others rated him. In actuality, the members were given prearranged false feedback. Some members were led to believe they were well accepted, and others were led to believe they were not terribly popular. Each member's conformity was measured by the opinions he subsequently expressed. Conformity 25. In further discussion of juvenile delinquency and by his vulnerability to group pressure during the performance of a simple perceptual task, the results showed that, for the individuals who valued their membership in the group, those who were led to feel only moderately accepted were more likely to conform to the norms and standards set by the group than were those who were led to feel totally accepted. In other words, it's easier for an individual who is securely ensconced in a group to deviate from that group. There are also some important cultural differences in the tendency to go against the group. One of these cultural differences is nicely illustrated by the following pieces of folk wisdom. In America, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In Japan, the nail that stands out gets pounded down. This general impression was confirmed by Rod Bond and Peter Smith. In an analysis of some 133 experiments using the Asch procedure in 17 different countries, they found that conformity is more prevalent in collectivist societies than in individualistic societies. 19. There also seems to be a small but consistent gender difference, with women conforming more than men. 20. It should be noted, however, that this gender difference is greatest when the researcher was male or when the group task was male-oriented. 21. The group exerting pressure. The other side of that issue, of course, has to do with the makeup of the group exerting the pressure. A group is more effective at inducing conformity if it consists of experts, the members are of high social status, or the members are comparable with the individual in some way. Thus, to go back to Sam, our hypothetical college student, I would speculate that it is more likely that Sam would conform to the pressure exerted by his acquaintances if he thought they were experts in politics and in making judgments about human sincerity. Similarly, he would be more likely to yield to those people if they had a lot of status or were important potential friends than if they were of no consequence to him. And finally, their being fellow students gives the judgments of Sam's acquaintances more impact on his behavior than, say, the judgment of a group of 10-year-old children, a group of construction workers, or a group of Portuguese biochemists. 26. The social animal. Conformity works much the same way when the source of influence is an individual rather than a group. Thus, we are more likely to conform to the behavior or opinions of an individual who is similar or important to us, or who appears to have expertise or authority in a given situation. For example, research has shown that people are more willing to comply with a demand from a person wearing a uniform than with someone in civilian clothes, even when it comes to relatively trivial matters. In one study, 22 pedestrians were asked to give spare change to a motorist who was parked at an expired meter. When the motorist was dressed as a uniformed parking officer, participants complied with her request far more often than when she was wearing either sloppy clothes or professional business attire. Thus, the appearance of authority, as potently symbolized by a uniform, can lend legitimacy to a demand, thereby generating high rates of compliance. On a broader level, popular writer Malcolm Gladwell 23 suggests that major social trends often change dramatically and suddenly through the mechanism of conformity when certain kinds of respected people happen to be in the right place at the right time. He calls these sudden changes, when a major change reaches a critical mass, the tipping point. And he calls the people who induce these changes connectors. These connectors can, by word of mouth alone, turn a struggling restaurant into a popular, overflowing place within a matter of weeks, or can take a small trend and turn it into an epidemic. According to Gladwell, connectors do not have to be experts, they are simply people who seem to be in the know and are talking about appropriate topics in appropriate places. How can people who are not medical experts induce large numbers of women to get regular mammograms? The place is important. In this instance, the tipping point happened in places where women gather informally and have the leisure to talk and listen to one another. The places were beauty salons, and the connectors were beauticians. Belonging versus getting information. People have a powerful need to belong. Acceptance and rejection are among the most potent rewards and punishments for social animals because, in our evolutionary history, social exclusion could have, conformity 27, disastrous consequences, namely being cut off from the resources and protection of the group in a dangerous world. Thus, Humans who passed their genes along were those with the strong inclination to fit in with the group. The legacy of this history is that most of us will go to great lengths to avoid social exclusion. 24 As I suggested earlier, there are two possible reasons why people like us might conform. One is that the behavior of others might convince us that our initial judgment was erroneous. The other is that conformity often secures our place within a group. The behavior of the individuals in Nash's experiment and in other similar experiments seem to be largely a matter of attempting to avoid exclusion. This can be inferred from the fact that there was very little conformity when participants were allowed to respond privately. At the same time, there are many situations in which we conform to the behavior of others because their behavior is our only guide to appropriate action. In short, we often rely on other people as a means of determining reality. The scene recalled by Thurber at the beginning of this chapter gives an example of this type of conformity. According to Leon Festinger, 25 When physical reality becomes increasingly uncertain, people rely more and more on social reality, that is, they are more likely to conform to what other people are doing. Not because they fear punishment from the group but because the group's behavior supplies them with valuable information about what is expected of them. An example should help clarify this distinction. Suppose that you need to use the toilet in an unfamiliar classroom building. Under the sign restrooms there are two doors, but unfortunately, a vandal has removed the specific designations from the doors so you cannot be certain which is the men's room and which is the women's room. Quite a dilemma. You are afraid to open either door for fear of being embarrassed or embarrassing others. As you stand there in dismay and discomfort, hopping from one foot to the other, the door on your left opens and out strolls a distinguished-looking gentleman. With a sigh of relief, you are now willing to forge ahead, reasonably secure in the knowledge that left is for men and right is for women. Why are you so confident? As we have seen, research has shown that the more faith an individual has in the expertise and trustworthiness of the other person, the greater the tendency to follow his or her lead and conform to his or her behavior. Thus, the actions of a distinguished-looking gentle, 28 The social animal, man would almost certainly be followed to a greater extent than, say, a seedy-looking fellow with wildly darting eyes and body odor. Indeed, research on jaywalking indicates that people will conform more often to the behavior of a seemingly high-status person than to the behavior of someone who looks less respectable or less well-to-do. Across several studies, researchers have found that, when in the presence of a model who refrains from jaywalking, other pedestrians are more likely to curb the impulse to jaywalk than people who are not exposed to any model. This conformity effect is much stronger, however, when the person modeling the behavior is neat and well-attired rather than disheveled and dressed in shabby clothes. 26. On wasting water, littering, and theft. Let us take this one step further. Institutions frequently request us to perform certain behaviors without making an outright demand. For example, in the men's shower room at my university's field house, there is a sign asking us to practice conservation by turning off the water while soaping up. Since this behavior is slightly inconvenient, I was not surprised when our systematic observation revealed that only 6% of the students conformed to this request. Subsequently, Michael O'Leary and I conducted a simple experiment aimed at inducing a greater number of people to conserve water and the energy needed to heat it. 27 We reasoned that people would be more likely to turn off the shower while soaping up if they believed other students took the request seriously. Accordingly, we enlisted the aid of a few male students who simply acted as models for the desired behavior, but we didn't want people to conform out of a fear of disapproval or punishment, so we set up the experiment in the following way. Our model entered the shower room when it was empty, went to the far end, turned his back to the entrance, and turned on the shower. As soon as he heard someone enter, he turned off the shower, soaped up, turned it back on, briefly rinsed off, and left the room without so much as glancing at the student who had entered. As he left, another student entered and surreptitiously noted whether the participant turned off the shower while soaping up. We found that 49% of the students followed suit. Moreover, when two students simultaneously modeled the appropriate, conformity 29, behavior, The percentage of people obeying the sign zoomed to 67. Thus, in an ambiguous situation, other people can induce conformity by providing us with information suggestive of what people generally do in a given situation. Let's look at the cultural norm against littering. Littering does not seem like a big deal to most people, and that's part of the problem. Most people think nothing of leaving a little trash around, but the little trash accumulates, polluting our environment and costing taxpayers a great deal of money. In California alone, the cost of cleaning up roadside litter now exceeds $120 million a year. Suppose, as you approach your car in the parking lot of the local library, you notice that someone has stuck one of those annoying flyers under your windshield wiper. So you remove it and, without thinking, crumple it up. The crucial question: do you throw it on the ground or shove it into your pocket so that you can drop it in a trash can later? The answer, to a large extent, it depends on what other people are doing. In a clever experiment, Robert Cialdini and his associates 28 placed flyers under the windshield wipers of a number of cars and waited to observe what each driver did when he or she discovered them. For some people, when they first left the library, an accomplice of the experimenters walked past them, stooped down, picked up a discarded fast food bag that was lying in the street, and placed it in a trash can. In the control condition, no bag was lying on the ground. The accomplice simply walked past the people who were headed toward their car. In the control condition, when the people got to their car and noticed the flyer, 37% threw it on the ground. In the modeling condition, only 7% threw the flyer on the ground. In a parallel experiment, 29 researchers used a more subtle technique of informational influence. They eliminated the human model and, instead, manipulated the appearance of the parking lot. Specifically, when the experimenters had previously littered the parking lot with flyers, the majority of the drivers simply followed suit, probably thinking, after all, if no one cares about the cleanliness of the parking lot, why should I? Interestingly enough, people were much less likely to litter if there was one piece of litter on the ground nearby than if the parking lot was completely free of litter. The reason is that seeing one piece of litter reminds us of litter, and shows us that the vast majority of people are subscribing to that norm of not littering. If the parking lot is free of litter, most people probably, 30 the social animal, do not even think about the norm and, therefore, will be more likely to litter mindlessly. In a recent field experiment, Kees Kaiser and his associates 30 took this reasoning one step further, to show that when the environment suggests a disregard for the rules, this can spill over into other domains of behavior. Kaiser's team left a large envelope hanging partway out of a public mailbox in an urban area of a city in the Netherlands, as though someone had hurriedly, and unsuccessfully, tried to mail the letter. Through the address window in the envelope a €5 bill showed through. Would passers-by who saw it push the envelope into the mailbox, or would they steal the envelope with the money? The answer depended greatly on a critical detail manipulated by the experimenters. Sometimes the mailbox had graffiti on it and there was litter strewn about the area. Sometimes the mailbox and area were clean. In the clean mailbox condition, only 13% of the passers-by stole the envelope. With the graffiti and litter, 27% of the passers-by stole the letter. You may recognize this as a test of the broken windows theory, which holds that when the environment sends the message that people don't care, the disorder spreads to human behavior, as if people say to themselves, "Oh, what the hell, if others are going to behave irresponsibly, I might as well, too." In these experiments, conformity was induced by information rather than by fear. But it is not always easy to distinguish between the two types of conformity. Often the behavior is identical. The key element that differentiates the two processes is the presence or absence of a punitive agent. Imagine that, in the mythical nation of Fredonia, it is considered gracious for guests to belch after reading as a way of showing the host that they enjoyed the meal. Suppose you didn't know this, and you were visiting the home of a Fredonian dignitary in the company of some diplomats from the U.S. State Department. If, after the meal, these diplomats began to belch, chances are you would belch, also. They were providing you with valuable information. On the other hand, suppose you were in the same home in the company of some rather rude and brawny young men who were introduced to you as members of the Freydonian Olympic heavyweight wrestling team. If these behemoths belched after their meal, my guess is that you might not go along with this behavior. That is, you would probably consider this an act of bad manners and would avoid belching. However, if they glared at you for your failure to follow suit, you might indeed belch. Conformity 31. 2. Not because of the information they supplied but because you feared rejection or reprisal for refusing to be a good sport by going along with their boorish behavior. I would suggest that conformity resulting from the observation of others for the purpose of gaining information about proper behavior tends to have more powerful ramifications than conformity in the interest of being accepted or of avoiding punishment. I would argue that, if we find ourselves in an ambiguous situation wherein we must use the behavior of other people as a template for our own behavior, it is likely that we will repeat our newly learned behavior, without a cue, on subsequent similar occasions. This would be the case unless, of course, we later received clear evidence that our actions were inappropriate or incorrect. Thus, to go back to our example, suppose you are re-invited to the home of the Freydonian dignitary for dinner, but this time you are the only guest. The question is, do you or don't you belch after the meal? A moment's reflection should make the answer perfectly clear. If you had belched after the first meal at his home because you realized it was the proper thing to do, you would be quite likely to belch when dining alone with the dignitary. However, if you had belched the first time out of fear of rejection or punishment, you would almost certainly not belch when you are the lone guest. To go back to Sam and the political candidate on television, you can now readily understand one of the many reasons why it would be so difficult for us to predict how Sam would actually vote in the election. If he had been merely going along with the group to avoid punishment or to gain acceptance, he would be likely, in the privacy of the polling booth, to vote for the candidate, in opposition to the view expressed by his acquaintances. If, on the other hand, Sam had been using the group as a source of information, he would almost certainly vote against the candidate that he had initially preferred. Social influence and emotion to repeat. When reality is unclear, other people become a major source of information. The generality of this phenomenon is nicely illustrated by some research performed by Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer, who demonstrated that people conform to others even in assessing something as personal and idiosyncratic as the quality of their own emotions. 31b. 32 The social animal. For describing this research, it is useful to clarify what is meant by emotions. According to William James, 32 an emotion has both a feeling component and cognitive content. His two-part conception of emotions can be likened to the process of playing a song on a jukebox. First, you need to activate the machine by inserting the coin, then you select the song you want to hear by pushing the right buttons. An emotion also requires both physiological arousal and label. Specifically, if we are walking in the forest and bump into a hungry and ferocious bear, we undergo a physiological change. This change produces excitement. Physiologically, this is a response of the sympathetic nervous system similar to one that might be produced by coming across a person with whom we are angry. We interpret this response as fear only when we cognitively become aware that we are in the presence of a fear-producing stimulus. But what if we experienced physiological arousal in the absence of an appropriate stimulus? For example, what if someone surreptitiously slipped into our drink a chemical that produced the same physiological response? Would we experience fear? William James would say that we wouldn't, not unless there was an appropriate stimulus around. Here is where Schachter and Singer enter the picture. In one experiment, they injected volunteers either with epinephrine, a synthetic form of adrenaline, which causes physiological excitation, or with a harmless placebo. All the participants were told that this chemical was a vitamin supplement called Ciproxin. They told some of those who received the drug that there would be side effects, including palpitations of the heart and hand tremors. These, indeed, are some of the effects of epinephrine. Accordingly, when these people experienced the epinephrine-produced symptoms, they had an appropriate explanation. In effect, when the symptoms appeared, they said to themselves, "My heart is pounding and my hands are shaking because of this injection I received and for no other reason." But other participants were not forewarned about these symptoms. Thus, when their hearts started pounding and their hands started trembling, what were they to make of it? The answer is that they made of it whatever the people around them made of it. Specifically, a stooge was introduced into the situation, and the participants were informed that he had also received an injection of Suproxen. In one situation, the stooge was programmed to behave in a euphoric manner; in another, he was, conformity 33, programmed to express a great deal of anger. Picture yourself in this situation. You are alone in this room with a person who supposedly has just been injected with the same drug you received. He bounces around energetically, happily wads up paper into balls, and begins sinking hook shots into the wastebasket. His euphoria is obvious. Gradually, the chemical you were given begins to take effect, and you begin to feel your heart pounding, your hands trembling, and so on. What emotion do you feel? Most participants in this situation reported a feeling of euphoria, and behaved happily. On the other hand, imagine that instead of being placed in a room with a euphoric stooge, you were placed in a room with a stooge programmed to behave in an angry manner. He complains about a questionnaire you both are filling out, and eventually, in a fit of extreme annoyance, he rips up the questionnaire and angrily hurls it into the wastebasket. Meanwhile, the symptoms of epinephrine are becoming apparent. You feel your own heart pounding, and your hands begin to tremble. How do you feel? In this situation, the vast majority of the participants felt angry and behaved in an angry fashion. It should be noted that, if the people were given a placebo, or if they were forewarned about the symptoms of the drug that they had been given, they were relatively unaffected by the antics of the stooge. To sum up this experiment, when physical reality was clear and explainable, the participants' emotions were not greatly influenced by the behavior of other people. However, when they were experiencing a strong physiological response, the origins of which were not clear, they interpreted their own feelings as either anger or euphoria, depending on the behavior of other people who supposedly were in the same chemical boat. Social influence, life and death. As we have seen, the influence of other people, whether intentional or not, can have an important effect on a person's behavior. Unless we understand how this process works, these effects can have major unwanted consequences for society, as well. An investigation by Craig Haney into the death qualification procedure provides an interesting and instructive example. 33 Basically, the death qualification procedure refers to the process whereby, in selecting a jury for a murder trial, prospective jurors who are opposed to the death penalty are systematically excluded from the 34 The social animal jury. This procedure takes place in the presence of those people who are eventually selected to serve on the jury. Haney, who is both an attorney and a social psychologist, reasoned that it is possible that when jurors who believe in capital punishment witness others being dismissed because they oppose the death penalty, this may subtly suggest to them that the law disapproves of people who oppose the death penalty. This conclusion may increase their tendency to impose the death penalty. To test this notion, Haney performed an experiment in which a random sample of adults was shown a videotape of a convincing jury selection procedure filmed in the moot courtroom of a law school, a highly realistic setting complete with all the courtroom accoutrements. Experienced trial lawyers served as prosecutor, defense attorney, and judge on the videotape. In one condition, the procedure included a segment on death qualification; in the other condition, this segment did not appear. Compared with people in the control condition, those who viewed the death qualification segment were more convinced of the defendant's guilt, believed it was more likely that he would receive the death penalty, and also believed that the judge thought he was guilty. They themselves were also more likely to impose the death penalty if the defendant were convicted. Thus, the factors that influence our opinions and behavior can be subtle, and they may be a matter of life and death. Responses to social influence. Thus far, I have been describing two kinds of conformity in more or less commonsensical terms. This distinction was based upon whether the individual was being motivated by rewards and punishments or by a need to know, and the relative permanence of the conforming behavior. Let us move beyond this simple distinction to a more complex and useful classification that applies not only to conformity but to the entire spectrum of social influence. Instead of using the simple term conformity, I would like to distinguish among three kinds of responses to social influence: compliance, identification, and internalization. 34. Compliance. The term compliance best describes the behavior of a person who is motivated by a desire to gain reward or avoid punishment. Typically, the person's behavior is only as long-lived as the conformity. 35. Promise of reward or the threat of punishment. Thus, one can induce a rat to run a maze efficiently by making it hungry and placing food at the end of the maze. Chances are that a ruthless dictator could get a percentage of his citizens to indicate their allegiance by threatening them with torture if they don't comply or by promising to feed and enrich them if they do. On the level of compliance, most researchers see little difference between the behavior of humans and other animals because all organisms are responsive to concrete rewards and punishments. Thus, remove the food from the goal box and the rat will eventually stop running the maze. Remove the food or the threat of punishment and the citizens will cease showing allegiance to the dictator. Identification. The term identification describes a response to social influence brought about by an individual's desire to be like the influencer. In identification, as in compliance, we do not behave in a particular way because such behavior is intrinsically satisfying. Rather, we adopt a particular behavior because it puts us in a satisfying relationship to the person or persons with whom we are identifying. Identification differs from compliance in that we do come to believe in the opinions and values we adopt, although we do not believe in them very strongly. Thus, if we find a person or a group attractive or appealing in some way, we will be inclined to accept influence from that person or group and adopt similar values and attitudes, not to obtain a reward or avoid a punishment, but simply to be like that person or group. I refer to this as the good old Uncle Charlie phenomenon. Suppose you have an uncle named Charlie who happens to be a warm, dynamic, exciting person. Ever since you were a young child, you loved him and wanted to grow up to be like him. Uncle Charlie is a corporate executive who has a number of strong opinions, including a deep antipathy to social welfare legislation. That is, he is convinced that anyone who really tries can earn a decent wage and that, by handing money to people, the government only succeeds in eliminating their desire to work. As a young child, you heard Uncle Charlie announce this position on several occasions. And it has become part of your system of beliefs, not because you thought it through and it seemed right to you or because Uncle Charlie rewarded you for adopting this position. Rather, it has become part of your belief system. 36. The social animal. Because of your liking for Uncle Charlie, which has produced in you a tendency to incorporate into your life that which is his. This phenomenon occurs often when we encounter the opinions of people we like or admire, even relative strangers. Jeffrey Cohen and Michael Prinstein 35 asked high school students to participate in online chat room discussions with one another. One of the topics being discussed was what students would do if offered marijuana at a party. In one condition, the participants were led to believe that they were chatting with two popular and admired classmates from their school. In the other, these classmates were identified as students of merely average popularity. When participants believed they were chatting with the classmates who were popular, they were far more likely to adopt their opinions. If the admired classmates said they would smoke the marijuana, the participants tended to agree that they, too, would smoke the marijuana. If the admired classmates said they would refuse the marijuana, so did the participants. Unlike the conformity in the Ash experiment, which was merely compliance, the influence here was durable. It was evident even later when participants were asked to give their opinions about marijuana in private. Internalization. The internalization of a value or belief is the most permanent, most deeply rooted response to social influence. The motivation to internalize a particular belief is the desire to be right. Thus, the reward for the belief is intrinsic. If the person who provides the influence is perceived to be trustworthy and to have good judgment, We accept the belief he or she advocates and we integrate it into our system of values. Once it is part of our own system, it becomes independent of its source and will become extremely resistant to change. Let us discuss some of the important distinguishing characteristics of these three responses to social influence. Compliance is the least enduring and has the least effect on the individual because people comply merely to gain reward or to avoid punishment. The complier understands the force of the circumstance and can easily change his or her behavior when the circumstance no longer prevails. At gunpoint, I could be made to say almost anything, but with the threat of death removed, I could quickly shrug off those statements and their implications. If a child is kind and generous to his younger, conformity 37, brother to obtain a cookie from his mother, he will not necessarily become a generous person. He has not learned that generosity is a good thing in itself. What he has learned is that generosity is a good way to get cookies. When the cookie supply is exhausted, his generous behavior will eventually cease unless that behavior is bolstered by some other reward. Rewards and punishments are important means of inducing people to learn and perform specific activities, but they are very limited techniques of social influence because they must be ever present to be effective, unless the individual discovers some additional reason for continuing the behavior. This last point will be discussed shortly. Continuous reward or punishment is not necessary for the response to social influence that I call identification. The person with whom the individual identifies need not be present at all. All that is needed is the individual's desire to be like that person. For example, if Uncle Charlie moves to a different city and months go by without your seeing him, you will continue to hold beliefs similar to his as long as he remains important to you. He still holds the same beliefs. And these beliefs are not challenged by counter-opinions that are more convincing. But, by the same token, these beliefs can be changed if Uncle Charlie has a change of heart or if your love for Uncle Charlie begins to fade. They can also change if a person or a group of people who are more important to you than Uncle Charlie profess a different set of beliefs. For example, suppose you are away at college and you find a group of new, exciting friends who, unlike Uncle Charlie, are strongly in favor of social welfare. If you admire them as much as your uncle, you may change your beliefs to be more like them. Thus, a more important identification may supersede a previous identification. The effect of social influence through identification can also be dissipated by a person's desire to be right. If you have taken on a belief through identification and you are subsequently presented with a convincing counterargument by an expert and trustworthy person, you will probably change your belief. Internalization is the most permanent response to social influence precisely because your motivation to be right is a powerful and self-sustaining force that does not depend upon constant surveillance in the form of agents of reward or punishment, as does compliance. Or on your continued esteem for another person or group, as does identification. 38. The social animal. It is important to realize that any specific action may be caused by compliance, identification, or internalization. For example, let us look at a simple piece of behavior: obedience to the laws pertaining to fast driving. Society employs highway patrol officers to enforce these laws, and as we all know, people tend to drive within the speed limit if they are forewarned that a certain stretch of highway is being carefully scrutinized by these officers. This is compliance. It is a clear case of obeying the law to avoid paying a penalty. Suppose you were to remove the highway patrol. As soon as people found out about it, many would increase their driving speed, but some people might continue to obey the speed limit. A person might continue to obey because Dad always obeyed the speed limit or always stressed the importance of obeying traffic laws. This, of course, is identification. Finally, people might conform to the speed limit because they are convinced that speed laws are good, that obeying such laws helps to prevent accidents, and that driving at a moderate speed is a sane and reasonable form of behavior. This is internalization. And with internalization you would observe more flexibility in the behavior. For example, under certain conditions, at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning, with perfect visibility and no traffic for miles around, the individual might exceed the speed limit. The compliant individual, however, might fear a radar trap, and the identifying individual might be identifying with a very rigid model. Thus, both would be less responsive to important changes in the environment. Let us look at the major component in each response to social influence. In compliance, the important component is power, the power of the influencer to dole out the reward for compliance and punishment for non-compliance. Parents have the power to praise, give love, provide cookies, scream, give spankings, withhold allowances, and so on. Teachers have the power to paste gold stars on our foreheads or flunk us out of college, and employers have the power to praise, promote, humiliate, or discharge us. The U.S. government has the power to increase economic aid to or withhold it from a dependent nation. Thus, the government can use this technique to persuade a country in Latin America or the Middle East to hold a democratic election. Rewards and punishments are effective means for producing this kind of compliance, but we might ask whether mere compliance is desirable. To induce a nation to hold a democratic election is easier than to induce the rulers of that nation to think and rule democratically. Conformity 39. In identification, the crucial component is attractiveness, the attractiveness of the person with whom we identify. Because we identify with the model, we want to hold the same opinions that the model holds. Suppose a person you admire takes a particular stand on an issue. Unless you have strong feelings or solid information to the contrary, there will be a tendency for you to adopt this position. Incidentally, it is interesting to note that the reverse is also true. If a person or group that you dislike announces a position, there will be a tendency for you to reject that position or adopt the opposite position. Suppose, for example, that you dislike a particular group, and that group speaks out against raising the minimum wage. If you know nothing about the issue, your tendency will be to favor raising the minimum wage, all other things being equal. In internalization, the important component is credibility, the credibility of the person who supplies the information. For example, if you read a statement by a person who is highly credible, that is, someone who is both expert and trustworthy, you would tend to be influenced by it because of your desire to be correct. Recall our earlier example of the diplomats at the Fredonian dinner party. Your acceptance of their expertise made their behaviors seem like the right thing to do. Accordingly, my guess is that this behavior would become internalized. You would do it, thereafter, because you believed it to be right. Recall the experiment on conformity performed by Solomon Asch, in which social pressure induced many participants to conform to the erroneous statements of a group. When participants in this kind of situation are allowed to respond in private, conformity all but disappears. Clearly, then, internalization or identification is not involved. It seems obvious that participants in these experiments are complying with the unanimous opinion of the group to avoid the punishment of ridicule or rejection. When identification or internalization are involved, the conforming behavior tends to persist in private. The trichotomy of compliance, identification, and internalization is a useful one. At the same time, like most ways of classifying the world, it is not perfect. There are some places where the categories overlap. Specifically, although it is true that compliance and identification are generally more temporary than internalization, there are, 40 the social animal, circumstances that can increase their permanence. For example, permanence can be increased if an individual makes a firm commitment to continue to interact with the person or group of people that induced the original act of compliance. Thus, in an experiment by Charles Kiesler and his colleagues, 36 when participants believed that they were going to continue interacting with an unattractive discussion group, they not only complied publicly, but they also seemed to internalize their conformity, that is, they changed their private opinions as well as their public behavior. This kind of situation will be discussed in greater detail in Chapter 5. Permanence can also result if, while complying, we discover something about our actions, or about the consequences of our actions, that makes it worthwhile to continue the behavior even after the original reason for compliance is no longer forthcoming. This is called a secondary gain. For example, in behavior modification therapy, An attempt is made to eliminate unwanted or maladaptive behavior by systematically punishing that behavior, by rewarding alternative behaviors, or both. For example, various attempts have been made to use this technique as a way of helping people kick the cigarette habit. 37 individuals might be given a series of painful electric shocks while performing the usual rituals of smoking, lighting a cigarette, bringing it up to their lips, inhaling, and so on. After several trials, the individual will refuse to smoke. Unfortunately, it is fairly easy for people to notice a difference between the experimental situation and the world outside. They realize they will not be shocked when smoking outside of the experimental situation. Consequently, a person may later experience a little residual anxiety when lighting a cigarette, but because electric shocks are clearly not forthcoming, the anxiety eventually fades. Thus, many people who temporarily cease smoking after this form of behavior modification will eventually smoke again after electric shock is no longer a threat. How about those who stay off cigarettes after behavior modification? Here is the point. Once we have been induced to comply, and therefore do not smoke for several days, it is possible for us to make a discovery. Over the years, we may have come to believe it was inevitable that we awaken every morning with a hacking cough and a hot, dry mouth, but after refraining from smoking for a few days, we may discover how delightful it feels to have a clear throat, fresh breath, and an unparched mouth. This, conformity 41. Discovery may be enough to keep us from smoking again. Thus, although compliance, in and of itself, usually does not produce long-lasting behavior, it may set the stage for events that will lead to more permanent effects. Obedience as a form of compliance. I indicated that acts of compliance are almost always ephemeral. This does not mean they are trivial. Impermanent behavior can be extremely important. This fact has been demonstrated dramatically by Stanley Milgram in a series of studies of obedience. 38. Picture the scene in his initial experiment. 40 men volunteer for an experiment advertised as a study of learning and memory. But this is just the cover story. Actually, it is a study of the extent to which people will obey authority. When the volunteer appears at the lab for his appointment, he is paired with another man, and a somewhat stern experimenter in a technician's coat explains that they will be testing the effects of punishment on learning. The exercise requires one person, the learner, to memorize a list of word pairs on which the other person, the teacher, will test him. The two men draw slips to determine their roles. The actual participant draws the role of teacher. He is led to a shock generator, which has an instrument panel with a row of 30 toggle switches, calibrated from a low point of 15 volts and extending through levels of moderate and severe shocks to a high of 450 volts. By throwing the successive switches, the teacher will deliver an increasingly intense shock each time the learner fails to answer correctly. Then the subject follows the experimenter and the other men into the next room, where the learner is strapped into an electric chair apparatus and is attached by electrodes to the shock generator. In response to the learner's inquiry about his mild heart condition, the experimenter reassures him, although the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage. In actuality, the learner knows that he needn't worry. He is not a real participant but is an accomplice of the experimenter, and the drawing to assign roles has been rigged so that he will play the role of the learner and the real participant will be the teacher. The learner is not really wired to the electricity. But the teacher has no reason to doubt that the man in the next room is wired to the shock generator. 42. The social animal, Torah that he operates. He has even experienced a sample shock. He hears the learner react as if he is really being hurt, and he is convinced that the shocks are extremely painful. As the exercise begins, the learner responds correctly several times but makes mistakes on a few trials. With each error, the teacher throws the next switch, supposedly administering a shock of increasing intensity. With the fifth shock, at 75 volts, the victim begins to grunt and moan. At 150 volts, he asks to be let out of the experiment. At 180 volts, he cries out that he can't stand the pain. As the shock levels approach the point labeled danger, extreme shock, the teacher hears the learner pound the wall and beg to be let out of the room, but this, of course, does not constitute a correct response, so the experimenter instructs the teacher to increase the voltage and deliver the next shock by throwing the next switch. The participants in this experiment were a random sample of businessmen, professional men, white-collar workers, and blue-collar workers in Connecticut. What percentage of these people continued to administer shocks to the very end of the experiment? How long would you have continued? Every year in my social psychology class, I pose these questions. And every year some 99% of the 240 students in the class indicate that they would not continue to administer shocks after the learner began to pound on the wall. The guesses made by my students are consistent with the results of Milgram's survey of 40 psychiatrists at a leading medical school.